Just after sunrise on a cold November morning in 2008, Daniel Walker watched his older brother sign away half of the only place either of them had ever called home, and as the lawyer quietly reached for the papers, the last words their father had spoken before he died suddenly became far more frightening than either brother had realized. The lawyer slid the survey map across the old wooden desk, carefully positioning it between the two brothers before quietly saying, "Your father left the land equally to both of you, so from this moment forward, what happens to it is entirely your decision." Words that disappeared into a silence so heavy neither brother seemed willing to disturb it, until Michael reached for the pen without the slightest hesitation, signed his name across the bottom of the page, pushed the papers back toward the lawyer, and calmly said, "Put my half up for sale." Daniel never looked at the papers because his eyes remained fixed on the section of the map where the old farmhouse stood, the same porch where their father had taught them to shell corn on summer evenings, repair broken fence posts after storms, and believe that a family's roots were worth protecting long after the people who planted them were gone, leaving him to quietly ask, "You're really going to sell the land Dad spent his whole life trying to keep together?" Michael leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and answered without a trace of doubt, "I'm selling dirt, Daniel, not memories. Dad spent his whole life working himself to the bone for this place, and I refuse to spend mine doing the same when I can build something better." Daniel lowered his eyes to the map once more, because arguing felt pointless after hearing the certainty in his brother's voice. Yet, as the lawyer gathered the signed papers together, he suddenly found himself hearing his father's weak voice from only 3 nights earlier, when the old man had reached for both of their hands and quietly whispered, "Boys, whatever you do," before stopping to catch his breath. "Don't let money convince you to sell the only place that will always know your name." At the time, neither brother had fully understood what their father meant. One believed he was simply an old farmer afraid of change. The other believed he was hearing the most important lesson his father would ever leave behind. It would take 15 years for both brothers to discover which one had been right. 3 days earlier, before lawyers unfolded maps, before signatures divided 200 acres into 2 separate futures, and before 2 brothers discovered that grief has a way of revealing what people truly value, the Walker family farmhouse was unusually quiet because John Walker, the man who had spent 43 years turning stubborn ground into a thriving farm, knew the strength that had carried him through countless harvests was finally leaving him. The bedroom window overlooked the same fields John had watched every morning for most of his life, and although age had bent his shoulders and illness had stolen much of his strength, his eyes still drifted toward the land with the quiet affection of a man looking at an old friend who had never once failed him, while Daniel sat beside the bed, changing the cool cloth on his father's forehead, and Michael stood silently near the doorway, both knowing they were sharing moments that would never come again. John eventually broke the silence by asking them to help him onto the porch because he wanted to feel the morning air one last time. And after the brothers carefully carried him outside, he spent several quiet minutes looking across the fields before softly saying, "People think I've spent my whole life building this farm," causing both brothers to look toward him as he smiled faintly and continued, "But the truth is, this farm spent its whole life building me." Neither brother answered because they had heard their father speak about the land before, though never with the quiet certainty that filled his voice that morning. And after another thoughtful silence, John looked first at Daniel, then at Michael, before gently adding, "You'll both inherit the same acres, but don't ever believe you're inheriting the same responsibility, because land doesn't belong to the man whose name is written on the deed." His tired voice pausing as he caught his breath before finishing, "It belongs to the man willing to care for it after everyone else loses interest." Michael respectfully nodded, though part of him still believed his father was speaking, as every old farmer eventually did, unable to imagine life beyond the fences they had always known, while Daniel quietly lowered his eyes because he understood that his father wasn't talking about farming at all. He was talking about stewardship. 2 mornings later, the church bell echoed across Ash Creek as neighbors gathered beneath gray autumn skies to say goodbye to John Walker, and by the time the last handshake had been exchanged and the final truck disappeared down the long gravel drive, the farmhouse that had once been filled with laughter now held only 2 grieving brothers, and a future neither of them yet realized would be decided before another sunrise. The surveyors arrived less than 2 weeks after John's funeral, and by the time the morning sun climbed above the oak trees lining the eastern fence, bright wooden stakes had already been driven into the soil that John Walker had spent more than 4 decades keeping together, leaving neighbors to stop along the roadside in quiet disbelief, because for as long as anyone could remember, the Walker farm had always been spoken of as one piece of land, never 2. Daniel stood beside the old pasture fence, watching the surveyors stretch their measuring tapes across the fields where he and Michael had once chased each other as boys, and although the men were simply doing the job they had been hired to do, every stake they hammered into the ground felt less like a property marker and more like another reminder that grief had found one more way to divide a family already struggling to hold itself together. Michael arrived shortly afterward with a real estate agent riding beside him, climbed out of his truck without looking toward the farmhouse, and walked straight to the edge of the field where the survey map matched the freshly placed markers before quietly saying, "The buyer wants to close before the end of the month, so let's not drag this out any longer." Words that caused Daniel to stare across the farm for a long moment before asking, "Have you even walked this land since we buried Dad?" Michael sighed, shook his head, and answered, "I've walked it my whole life, Daniel, and that's exactly why I'm leaving. Dad worked every day until he couldn't stand anymore, and I'm not going to spend the next 40 years doing the same thing just because this place carries our last name. I have a chance to start over, and I'm taking it." Daniel looked toward the weathered farmhouse, standing quietly beyond the fields, before replying, "Maybe Dad wasn't trying to leave us a way out. Maybe he was trying to leave us something worth staying for." But Michael only smiled politely, reached out to shake the real estate agent's hand, and said, "Draw up the papers." Within days, the machinery parked on Michael's side of the property had been auctioned. The cattle trailers rolled away one by one, and the old barn he had inherited stood almost empty for the first time since John Walker built it, while neighbors gathered along the fence lines watching years of family history disappear behind the rumble of diesel engines. Some quietly saying Michael was making the smartest financial decision anyone in Ash Creek had seen in years, though others simply watched in silence because something about seeing the Walker farm divided made the whole town feel as though it had lost something too. The money arrived quickly, and so did the changes, because before another month had passed, Michael had bought a beautiful new truck, moved into a modern house outside the city, and proudly told anyone who asked that selling the farm had been the best decision he had ever made, leaving more than a few people wondering whether perhaps John Walker had loved the land a little too much after all. Daniel, meanwhile, stayed exactly where he was, waking before sunrise every morning to repair broken fences, mend aging equipment, and work fields that suddenly felt twice as large now that he faced them alone. Yet although the work exhausted him more than he cared to admit, every evening before walking back to the farmhouse, he found himself standing for a few quiet moments on the porch where his father had taken his last breath, remembering the words John had spoken only days before he died. "Land doesn't belong to the man whose name is written on the deed." The sentence lingered in Daniel's heart as he looked across the fields glowing beneath the evening sun. It belongs to the man willing to care for it after everyone else loses interest. Daniel quietly looked over the empty half of the farm where the for sale sign still stood beside the road, took a slow breath, and whispered to himself, "I'll stay, Dad." The first year after the land was divided seemed to prove Michael right, because almost every piece of news reaching Ash Creek suggested his new life was moving exactly the way he had hoped, leaving neighbors to admire the beautiful house he had bought on the edge of the city, the new pickup sitting proudly in the driveway, and the construction company he had started with the money from the land, while people inside the feed store quietly shook their heads and wondered whether perhaps John Walker had spent his whole life holding on to something that no longer made sense in a changing world. Daniel heard those conversations more often than anyone realized, because every Saturday morning he still stopped by the feed store for seed, parts, and supplies, listening quietly as people praised Michael for having the courage to move forward while gently questioning whether staying behind had been the wiser choice. Though he never argued with anyone because his father had always believed time was better at settling disagreements than words ever could be. Back on the farm, however, life looked very different from the picture people imagined, because every broken fence, every worn-out machine, and every unexpected repair now belonged to one man instead of two, forcing Daniel to work longer days than his father ever had simply to keep the farm moving, and although there were evenings when exhaustion followed him all the way to the porch, he still found himself looking across the fields before going inside, quietly remembering the promise he had made the morning Michael drove away. Meanwhile, Michael's confidence continued growing because the construction business expanded faster than anyone expected. New contracts kept arriving, and for a while it genuinely seemed as though selling the land had opened every door. His father had spent a lifetime trying to force open, with hard work alone, leaving him increasingly convinced that sentiment had been the only thing keeping the Walker family tied to a future that had never been as promising as people wanted to believe. Then, almost without warning, the first crack appeared. A commercial project that should have brought in enough money to carry the business for an entire year suddenly collapsed after the developer filed for bankruptcy, leaving Michael unpaid for months of work and forcing him to borrow heavily just to keep paying his employees because he believed the setback was temporary and that the next opportunity would recover everything he had lost. Instead, the next opportunity became another disappointment, followed by rising debts, delayed payments, and difficult conversations with the bank that slowly replaced the excitement he had once felt every morning, until the same phone that used to ring with new contracts now seemed to ring only with reminders that another bill had become overdue. Daniel knew nothing about any of it because the brothers rarely spoke anymore. Not because either of them hated the other, but because every conversation somehow drifted back to the decision they had made inside the lawyer's office, leaving both men quietly avoiding the subject. Neither one knew how to revisit without reopening old wounds. One evening, after finishing repairs on the old tractor his father had bought nearly 20 years earlier, Daniel noticed a letter waiting inside the farmhouse, and although it came from Michael, it contained only a few short lines asking how the farm was doing, before ending with the words, "I hope you're still proving Dad right," a sentence Daniel read several times before carefully folding the letter and placing it inside the same Bible where John Walker had once written the birth dates of both his sons, because something about those words didn't sound like the confident brother who had walked away from the farm believing money could build a better future. For the first time since the land had been divided, Daniel found himself wondering whether Michael's silence had been hiding far more than success. The months that followed were harder on Michael than anyone outside the city ever realized, because while people in Ash Creek still assumed the brother who sold the land was living the life they had once admired, The reality looked very different behind the front door of the beautiful house he had worked so hard to buy, where unpaid invoices slowly piled across the kitchen table, late-night phone calls from creditors replaced conversations about new opportunities, and the confidence that had once convinced him selling the farm was the smartest decision of his life quietly began giving way to something far heavier. He fought harder than anyone knew because pride has a way of convincing people that asking for help means admitting defeat, leaving Michael to pour what little savings he had left into keeping the business alive, sell equipment he had once been proud to own, and reassure his employees that things would improve soon, even as he lay awake most nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how a future that had seemed so certain could disappear so quickly. The bank eventually gave him more time than he expected, but time alone couldn't repair a business built on money that never arrived. And before another year had passed, the construction company closed its doors, the new truck was repossessed, the house was sold to settle debts, and nearly everything the land had paid for quietly disappeared, leaving Michael standing in the parking lot outside the empty office one cold evening with nothing in his hands except a cardboard box holding a few family photographs and the old pocket knife his father had carried every day of his life. As he drove away for the last time, the photograph resting on the passenger seat caught his attention because it showed two young boys standing beside John Walker in front of the old farmhouse, all three covered in dust after repairing a fence together, and although Michael couldn't remember who had taken the picture, he remembered exactly what his father had said moments before it was taken. "Boys, there'll come a day when life convinces you that success is something you can buy, but don't ever trade the place that taught you who you are for the things the world says you ought to become." Words Michael had laughed at back then because they sounded like something only an old farmer would believe, though sitting alone inside his truck all those years later they no longer sounded old. They sounded painfully true. For several weeks he drifted from one temporary job to another, rented small rooms he never bothered decorating, and told anyone who asked that he was simply starting over again, yet every evening he found himself driving a little farther into the countryside without really knowing why, until one afternoon he realized the road beneath his tires was the very same one that had carried him away from Ash Creek 15 years earlier. He slowed as the familiar hills appeared beyond the windshield, passed the weathered church where his father's funeral had been held, crossed the old wooden bridge leading into town, and finally stopped beside the rusted gate of the Walker farm, where he sat without moving, because beyond the fence stood the farmhouse. He had convinced himself was nothing more than an old building, though at that moment it felt like the only place in the world that still remembered the boy he used to be. His eyes settled on the porch where his father had spent those final autumn mornings watching the fields, and before he even realized what was happening, tears began running quietly down his face, because for the first time since signing those papers in the lawyer's office, Michael understood what he had actually sold. It had never been the acres, it had never been the money, it had been the only road that always led him home. He rested both hands on the steering wheel, closed his eyes, and whispered the words he wished he had spoken 15 years earlier. "I'm sorry, Dad." Michael remained sitting outside the rusted gate for what felt like hours, because every time he reached for the truck door, another memory pulled him back into the driver's seat, leaving him to wonder whether 15 years of silence had grown too wide for two brothers to cross. Yet as the evening sun settled behind the hills and the familiar porch light flickered on exactly as it had every night of his childhood, he finally took a deep breath, stepped onto the gravel road, and slowly began the longest walk of his life. Daniel was repairing the old front gate when he heard footsteps approaching, and without looking up he assumed another neighbor had stopped by to ask about the harvest. But as the footsteps grew closer, something about them felt strangely familiar, causing him to lift his head and freeze, because standing only a few yards away, older than he remembered, and carrying the quiet exhaustion of a man who had fought battles no one else had seen, was the brother he hadn't shared a real conversation with in almost 15 years. For several long moments neither of them spoke, because some silences carry too many years to be broken quickly, until Michael finally lowered his eyes and quietly said, "I almost turned around 3 times before walking through that gate." Words that brought the faintest smile to Daniel's face as he leaned the hammer against the fence and gently replied, "I know. I watched you sitting out there for nearly an hour." Michael gave a tired laugh that disappeared almost as quickly as it came before looking across the fields where the evening breeze moved through rows of healthy crops. Michael gave a tired laugh that disappeared almost as quickly as it came before looking across the fields where the evening breeze moved through rows of healthy crops, and after another long silence he softly admitted, "I spent years telling myself I sold land, but standing out there today, I realized I sold the only place that ever felt like home." A confession that seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders, because it was the first completely honest thing he had allowed himself to say since the morning he signed those papers. Daniel looked across the same fields their father had loved before, quietly answering, "Dad used to say a farm doesn't remember your mistakes, it only remembers whether you came back to care for it." Words that caused Michael to wipe at his eyes before shaking his head and saying, "After everything I said, after the way I walked away, I don't deserve to come back here." Daniel took a few slow steps toward his brother, rested one hand on the old wooden gate their father had built with them many years earlier, and smiled with the same quiet kindness John Walker had always shown people who needed another chance before saying, "Maybe not, but home was never something Dad believed people had to deserve." Then, after a gentle pause, he reached over, pushed the gate completely open, and finished with the words Michael had spent 15 years hoping he might one day hear, "Come home." Michael stood perfectly still, because he had prepared himself for anger, disappointment, even rejection. Yet he had never prepared himself for forgiveness, and as he looked through the open gate toward the farmhouse where his father had spent the last morning of his life, watching the fields he loved, the tears he had held back since leaving the city finally came without resistance, because he suddenly understood that the greatest inheritance John Walker had left behind had never been 200 acres of farmland. It had been a son who had learned how to forgive. The brothers walked toward the farmhouse together without another word, because some journeys no longer need explaining, and as they stepped onto the old porch where their father had once placed a weathered hand over both of theirs, Daniel quietly looked toward the empty rocking chair still resting beside the front door, before softly saying, "I think Dad knew one of us would leave," causing Michael to look at the chair for several moments before asking, "Then why did he leave my name on the deed?" Daniel smiled. "Because he wasn't leaving you land," he said quietly. "He was leaving you a road home." Neither brother spoke again for several moments, because there was nothing left to argue about, and as the last light disappeared beyond the fields John Walker had spent his life protecting, two brothers who had once allowed money to divide them quietly found each other again in the only place that had been waiting for both of them all along. Michael never returned to the city after that evening, because some journeys change a man so completely that there is no longer anything worth returning to, leaving him to move back into the little room he and Daniel had once shared as boys, while quietly learning the rhythms of the farm he had abandoned so many years before. And although his hands had long forgotten the feel of worn fence posts, heavy feed sacks, and cold tractor tools, Daniel never reminded him how much he still had to learn, because every morning he simply handed his brother another job, waited patiently while he figured it out, and quietly thanked God that some things broken by time can still be repaired by grace. The neighbors noticed the change almost immediately because before long, the sight of two Walker brothers repairing fences together became just as familiar as it had been before their father's illness, causing more than a few people to stop along the roadside, simply to watch without saying much, because everyone in Ash Creek remembered the day the land had been divided, yet very few had expected to live long enough to see the family made whole again. One Saturday afternoon, while replacing an old stretch of fence their father had built decades earlier, Michael paused to catch his breath before looking across the fields and quietly saying, "You know, I used to think Dad was leaving us land. Then I thought he was leaving us money I was foolish enough to walk away from. But I don't think either of us understood what he was really trying to leave behind," causing Daniel to smile as he drove another fence staple into the weathered post before replying, "Neither did I. Not until you came home." Words that lingered between them for a moment before both brothers looked across the farm with the quiet understanding that some lessons only make sense after life has finished teaching them. A few weeks later, the brothers walked together to the old oak tree overlooking the highest part of the property, carrying nothing more than 2 folding chairs and the small wooden box that had held their father's favorite pocket knife since the day he died, and after placing the box beneath the tree where John Walker had often sat watching the fields, they remained there until sunset, saying very little because love rarely needs many words once forgiveness has done its work. As the last light settled across the farm, Michael broke the silence by quietly admitting, "I spent 15 years believing I had thrown away my inheritance," before looking toward Daniel with grateful eyes and continuing, "But the truth is you protected it until I was finally ready to receive it," causing Daniel to shake his head with a gentle smile before answering, "Dad protected it. I was just stubborn enough to stay where he left it." The evening breeze moved softly through the fields as both brothers laughed for the first time in many years, and for a brief moment it almost felt as though John Walker might walk up the hill carrying his old hat beneath one arm, asking why they had stopped working before reminding them there would be plenty of time to rest after the harvest, a memory that brought tears and smiles together because grief never truly disappears when love has been real. Looking back now, people in Ash Creek still tell the story of the Walker brothers, though not because one sold his father's land while the other stayed behind, but because they eventually learned that families are not held together by fences, deeds, or even the acres they inherit, as those things can all be divided with the stroke of a pen, while forgiveness cannot, leaving John Walker's greatest harvest to grow long after every season of his life had ended, because the richest thing he ever raised was never the corn standing in his fields. It was the character growing inside his sons. If this story reminded you that some things in life are worth far more than money, we'd love to hear about it in the comments, because every family carries lessons that deserve to be remembered. And if you enjoy stories about faith, family, forgiveness, and the quiet wisdom hidden in ordinary country life, we'd be honored to have you join us again here on The Last Acre. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. And until next time, remember that the greatest harvests are often the ones that grow inside people.